We're here today with Dennis Martinez.
Okay, Mark, I think you would like me to read this quote.
Yes.
Okay. Probably you know him, he's pretty well known. His name is Simon Ortiz, Pueblo poet. I read it to you. The fate of our homelands, cultures, and communities is at stake. It is a life and death matter at this late hour. They, white people's cultures, are worth saving by trusting and teaching them what real sustainability is. White people's cultures are now tied to indigenous people's cultures. It's now or never. Now, that's a serious statement. And certainly people don't associate indigenous people's culture, and especially their cultural land care practices, as being something that is of moment. But in fact, he's saying it is. What indigenous peoples do on the land when they're doing their traditional land care praxis is very important, because non-indigenous peoples have lost that.
How does traditional ecological knowledge interface with Western norms or ideas about policy in terms of changing that destructive ways of the Western world?
What could we do?
What could we do?
Non-indigenous peoples have got to look to indigenous peoples to work with natural processes appropriately. And having done so for a very long time, gives them a standing of being able to teach non-indigenous peoples how to live with the land. And those agencies and governments that are entitled to take care of lands, to manage lands, to show them a way of how to do this. A lot of the work I do is working with ecologists and other scientists in trying to show them that it's possible for Western science and traditional ecological knowledge, for example, to be complementary. Scientists are interested in local data because they can't get it themselves. Their theories require it, and so they go sometimes to indigenous experts or knowledge holders to get that information. But it's really much more than that. There's a whole spiritual dimension to traditional knowledge, and that involves how to relate to the plants and animals in a spiritual way. And they can also teach this. But people don't have to accept that kind of spirituality, though, to be able to manage the land better, for sure. And I think Western science is beginning to catch up in lots of ways. First, it was with fire. There was a strong negative feeling among enviros against indigenous burning or anything.
Yeah.
They called that Paiute forestry. And they were very much against the agencies that forest
Was
service.
that in a derogatory
way?
Paiute forestry?
Paiute forestry. When agency personnel would go out and try to burn the land, that was denigrated by the term Paiute forestry. That was back in the 20s and 30s. Eventually they've come around to realizing that we need regular light fire, low intensity to moderate intensity fire, to keep the land in a healthy state. You know, if you start losing your water because there's so much brush and trees drawing it up through evapotranspiration, and suddenly your garden dies because you haven't got anything to drink because you're not taking care of your place. In other words, it can teach us to be native to our place. That's the essential thing. You don't have to be an Indian to be native to the place. That's an important point. There was even a time when the Canadian government allowed hunting of what they call over the hill, male muskox, because they were no longer productive, therefore useless. Yet, what the Inuit knew is that those muskox protected the younger members of the herd because they had the brains and the strength and so on to be able to get them in a circle when the wolves are around very quickly. And they knew how to break through hard ice to get the vegetation below so that they could eat it. And the same with the caribou. The muskox, in effect, helping the caribou, or as happens in Finland with the Sami up in the northern Scandinavian regions, now, because of climate change, unable to reach the grass and the lichens that they, well, especially lichens that they feed on. That's changing. The bison in Montana used to break the hard ice and snow for ranchers' cattle. Without the bison, they would have starved. So these things, indigenous people have always known, and that non-indigenous people are just beginning to learn. So it's that profound respect and understanding and equality of Native people and animals that's important.
When you say indigenous, what do you mean by that? Let's unpack that term.
So they're the people that are still tied pretty much to the land traditionally. They are minorities in nation states, and they carry with them probably the last remnant of our coevolutionary heritage that goes back to the Pleistocene. The definition of indigenous does vary. For example, in Africa, Maasai would be considered indigenous, but not the other tribes, for example, because they are closer to the land. I think the closeness to the land is probably the key thing, and the fact that they are apart from nation states to a large degree, and are regulated or feared by or exploited by those states.
Regulated, feared, or exploited, rather than seen as a resource, as a model of how to live.
Exactly, yeah.
How do you identify yourself by race, ethnicity, culture, or language?
I'm a mix by blood of several ethnicities. My dad's people came from northern Sonora and then southern Arizona. They were Tohono O'odham or Papago O'odham, and that line between the two is pretty hazy, so I'm not even sure myself exactly what side of the line I fall on. And Spanish Portuguese. I was a Mexican guy. I'm a Chicano. My mother's Swedish. She has Indian blood, and we did the genealogy, but we don't know the tribal name. But so I self-identify as an American Indian, Native American, yeah. Other people in my family don't. You see that a lot, and you'll see families with a whole mix of how people appear. Some very light in one family, some very dark. Invariably, the darker people will identify more as, you know, the native, and the lighter people who can pass, less so. But not all, just a few do that. Most people do accept their indigenous identity anyhow, but they could pass.
What is the relationship between traditional spirituality and, for example, over-harvesting or clear-cutting or other issues around resource management?
When scientists go out and they start studying animals, and they start trying to estimate population levels, for example, viable population levels, invariably, and I can't think of one contrary case, invariably, they will be wrong in the estimate of animal numbers, usually far lower. And because they're far lower, they'll put restrictions on hunting. For example, Inuit in the Arctic. It's happened all the time. The Canada Department of Oceans has time and time again restricted bowhead whale hunting or caribou hunting based on their own estimates. Up to 10 years sometimes it's taken for them to revise their estimates and find out that the Inuit were correct. Now I could give you lots more examples if we had time of that. So that indicates that people that have a knowledge, a working knowledge, because of long association since childhood, you know, of animals, know their habits so well that they know, for example, that extra herd of caribou that was missed goes over there and not here, or that bowhead whale pod is some kilometers away from where they thought it was. They knew where it was. It's just that they wouldn't listen to the Inuit until finally they had to admit it. I was invited to give a talk one time in Crestone, Colorado, to the fire department. Volunteer fire department invited me out because they'd heard me on radio in another city in Colorado. And they wanted help because all these very religious people, very spiritual people in Crestone, it's like a real spiritual mecca, you know, for a lot of different groups, Buddhists and whoever, New Age of all kinds are there, right? And there was a city ordinance that you couldn't cut a single tree over, I think, 4 inches, 3 inches, I think, 3 or 4 inches.
Thick.
Even if you were surrounded by a dense thicket of piñon and pine and juniper, and a fire would just take it out and you at the same time in a few seconds. No, can do it. So they invited me to talk to the community, and I was convinced, as with the fire department, was also convinced there's no way they're going to listen to me on this. They had made their minds up. So I told them about the story of the Indian people in southern Colorado, that they used to burn their piñon and pine groves every 7 or 8 years. That's when you get the best production, about the 7th or 8th year. And that by doing so, they had very few large catastrophic fires, if any. They had tall grasses, you know, tussock or perennial bunch grasses, as high as a horse's shoulder, because of regular light fires, right? And no overgrazing. Of course, the overgrazing killed everything. And yet, the right kind of rest rotation grazing, like light fire, like regular fire, is good for the land. That's something environmentalists are just beginning to learn. So I talked about what they did, and I was given a half an hour initially, and I took an hour and a half, and they decided to rescind the ordinance. So yeah, people can be reached.
Okay.
They can be reached.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.